Okay, so you'll notice on the slides for this week, right, that I have some quotes from Wong and Jeyakumar. So before I actually talk through the Jeyakumar essay, I want to direct your attention to these quotes. The construction of many myths reflects an urge to find explanations on how the world came to be in its present form. We discussed that in Wong. Jeyakumar, in fact, begins with this very idea. Every culture, he says, of the world has creation stories which attempt to trace the origin of the universe and its components with special reference to human beings. These stories are conditioned by the religious, cultural, social, and political context from which they originate. Remember, we talked about context influencing the way that we see the world and understand it. The same is true of interpretations of these narratives. Interpretations derive from a particular location. As such, creation stories may be used to explain and justify certain political, religious, and social realities that are oppressive and discriminatory, right? So Wong would point out, in her essay, would point out the way in which there's a gender hierarchy, or not a gender hierarchy, social stratification, so a stratification of class. Jeyakumar is going to point that out in terms of gender, right? So the question that I have here then is, when reading the Bible critically, we may ask, how did these texts function, and can they be read otherwise? Or is there only one correct interpretation, right? Maybe there are multiple interpretations, as many people as there are, right? We've just talked about in the last video from Wong, we've talked about the fact that, and we'll talk about this again with Williams, that you can read something literally and think that it was factually true, historically accurate. You can also read it figuratively and see it as conveying a message or explaining something, right? So another question, right? Are all texts and interpretations, in fact, influenced by ideology? So ideology itself, and you'll see here, we're thinking about the isms, right? And ideology is a set of opinions or beliefs of a group or an individual. Very often, ideology refers to a set of political beliefs or a set of ideas that characterize a particular culture, right? So political beliefs or a set of ideas that characterize a particular culture, they rely on basic assumptions about reality that may or may not have a factual basis. So these are the isms, right? Ethnocentrism, believing that your culture, your ethnic group, is the exception, is exceptional, is the most important, right? Is at the center of the world. Racism, right? That your race is better than another race. You look down on other races. Sexism, right? This is regarding gender. Sectarianism, this is regarding religion. Ableism, this is regarding that people who are able-bodied are in some sense better than, superior to those who are differently abled. Heterosexism, again, this would be those who are straight, in some way are superior to those who are LGBTQ+, capitalism, communism, and nationalism, right? Anyway, so these are some examples of isms. Now, I want to go ahead and move into Jeyakumar. We already read that first paragraph, trying to give some context. He goes on to say, here I will first explain, and this is his thesis, right? The traditional reading of each text, so that's the Hindu Purusa-Sukta and Genesis 1-3. I'll explain the traditional reading, which has fostered inequity and repression. Then I will explore an egalitarian rereading of both accounts. So we know right from the beginning, this is what he's going to do in this essay. So first, he gives us the world inside the text of the Purusa-Sukta, and he also gives us the traditional reading, right? So he talks about Brahman, right? The acts of Brahma. According to the Purusa-Sukta, creation is the result of the sacrifice of Purusha, the primeval being, who is all that exists. So then we see there's a dismemberment, and from this dismemberment comes animals, plants, rituals, sacred orders, right? The same sacrifice produced the gods, Indra, Agni, Vayu, right? From Purusha's navel came the atmosphere, his head, heaven. The four Varnas were also produced from Purusha. The mouth was the Brahman, the arms were the Kshatriya, the warriors, the thigh was general populace, and the feet the Sudra. So here again we see that from this dismemberment from Purusha, we also have a social class, and caste. He says this creation hymn is understood in all later Hindu scripture to sanction the caste system as divine ordination. Thus, India follows a social caste structure based on this ancient narrative. Because this is presented as divine, right, it legitimates a caste system wherein people must stay in their particular place in society. He goes on now to talk about Genesis, the traditional interpretation, right? God is the ruler over all creation. God alone commands and controls. God is over creation, creatures, and they have to submit to God. Man is created first, then woman, right? Therefore, woman is subordinate to man. This interpretation, he says, establishes God as superior to human beings and man as superior to woman. It has been used to oppress women folk and to propagate man's superiority over women. So that's Genesis 2-3. He says, I'm going to do an egalitarian reading. Okay, so traditional readings emphasize this hierarchy. Egalitarian readings, as the word indicates, means I'm going to read so that these things are equal to one another. Right? So he says in the Purusa-Sukta, a liberating reading. He says if it's egalitarian, it's liberating. Reading of the Genesis creation account presents the following insights. God is the source of creation. God is creator, but at the same time reactive and recreative. While the image of the deity is transcendent, Genesis 1 detaches God from human nature. The anthropomorphic picture of God in Genesis 2-3, right? Again, these two different depictions, emphasizes God's activity in the creative process and humankind's active role along with God. In other words, creatures participate with God as co-creators along with God. He says this reading dismantles the traditional and colonial idea of God as king or ruler and establishes a smooth nexus between God and humans over the natural world. He then says both male and female are created in the image and likeness of God. The creation of woman after man from his rib, he says, does not imply hierarchy, but it brings completion and wholeness. It's physical oneness. Interestingly, so that's at creation, but then we see after the punishment, there is sort of an order that's created, right? A hierarchy. He then says an egalitarian reading of the Purusa-Sukta would focus on the fact that every human being is from the same cosmic person. And he says because of that, they're all from the same flesh and there are no hierarchical differences, indicating their ultimate unity within the diversity of God's creation. The heterogeneous creation concepts highlights differences in creatures created by Brahma, but rejects a hierarchical social structure in which one group dominates and oppresses the other. He goes on and says, furthermore, the anthropomorphic account of Purusa-Sukta exposes God in human form and God sacrificing God's own body to create the human and natural world. It is thus a creation story of love and peace, he says, through the sacrificial love of Brahma, the whole world and humanity was formed. Here is then his conclusion. Creation means differences, plurality in creatures, and diversity in skills or tasks aside of the creatures, but no one is inferior or superior to another because all are created by God and from God. Even God is not superior since he is co-creator and sacrificially offers his own body. Finally, the created order demands the plurality of creatures with interdependence. It requires participation without dominance or hierarchical structure for peaceful coexistence. Thus, discrimination in the name of gender, caste, class, or any such form is against the created order. Now, we can see where Jeyakumar hails and what he's doing. Interesting to note, right, that he wants to read this as egalitarian, which means that it can be interpreted as egalitarian, right? Important to note the ways that it's been traditionally interpreted, right? And what we find inside the text to support both traditional and egalitarian readings depending on our perspective.